Hello and welcome to Legally Speaking, a production of the Macomb County Bar Foundation. Today we're going to be talking about domestic abuse, and we'll be joined by three leaders in this field. We'll be talking to Judge Richard Halloran, who recently retired from the Wayne County Family Law Bench, with Sarah Prout Rennie, who's the Executive Director of the Michigan Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence, and Brian Nicholas, a Macomb County Friend of the Court referee. They'll be talking about what domestic violence is, how we can address it, and I hope how to reduce its prevalence in our community. Hello and welcome to Legally Speaking. I'm Ashley Lowe, Chief Executive Officer at Lakeshore Legal Aid. At Lakeshore, we're a nonprofit law firm that provides free legal services to low-income people, seniors, and survivors of domestic abuse throughout the state. Today we'll be talking about domestic violence. And one thing that's important to start that conversation is a clear description and a definition of what domestic abuse really is. Domestic abuse is a pattern of power and control, where an abuser uses power tactics such as violence and other methods to control their intimate partner. We'll be talking more today about what that really means in the life of a survivor. Right now, I'm happy to be joined by Judge Richard Halloran, who recently retired from the Wayne County Family Court Bench. Judge Halloran, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Ashley.
Judge, you've been recognized for so much of your work on the bench and in your career in public service, but a lot of that has been focused on your work in domestic violence. Can you talk today about what drove you to being interested in preventing domestic abuse and why that's so important?
Sure. My daughter, when she was 13 years old, was walking home from school. There were three boys on the other side of the street. One boy walked across the street, slugged my daughter in the face, and then went back to his buddies. And we heard about it, was shocked. We tracked the kid down, and his explanation was he wanted to show his friends what it meant to be a man. And I remember thinking, what? Young kids think this is what it is to prove yourself? Shortly after, I became a magistrate in 36th District Court and attended a class in domestic violence. And I was appalled at what men do to control women. I would never have thought of doing that myself. And so from that point on, it was sort of a crusade on my part to try to end it. I was chair of the Wayne County Coordinating Council to Prevent Domestic Violence, was on the Michigan Domestic Violence Prevention and Treatment Board, and then ultimately was able to create three different courts, one in the 36th District Court, and then the Personal Protection Order docket in the Wayne County Circuit Court, and ultimately the Solution-Oriented Domestic Violence Prevention Court, which dealt with high lethality cases. So it's been my passion to try to end abusive behavior in basically the human race.
Judge, you mentioned personal protection orders, or PPOs. Can you describe what that is?
Sure. Personal protection order is basically an injunction telling the other person to stay away. I call it the bigger bully theory. It's a use of power, actually, in a power dynamic, in an abusive relationship, to tell the person, stay away, do not touch, do not call, do not contact. And it generally works. I would say 90–95% of the time it keeps people away. I was really pleased to hear you talk about the definition of domestic abuse versus domestic violence, because so many people think there has to be physical violence in order for it to be an abusive relationship. In so much time, the abusive relationships are intimidation, control, threatening, basically belittling the other person to get them to do what they want. And so we fail to recognize that abusive behavior is the real problem, not necessarily physical violence.
Could there be domestic abuse with no violence at all?
Definitely, definitely. If you've got a partner who wants to know what you're doing all the time, limits your availability to your family, prohibits you from having friends, wants to control all your money, tells you how stupid you are, how ugly you are, how dumb you are, how you can't find anybody but me, there's no physical violence in that. It's all intimidation. And that's the real problem, is abusive behavior. So I always like to use the phrase domestic abuse, because abusive behavior is part of what is going on with sexual violence, what's going on with intimidation, what's going on with bullying, and so many other types of abusive behavior that can be used, that you can use a personal protection order to stop. Because you come to the court, you present your case. If the court finds it's a behavior that's reasonable people would believe should be stopped, the court will order that behavior stopped and enforce it as a misdemeanor crime. And anybody can get them from any of their circuit courts in whatever county they live in.
Judge, you mentioned in your career you started a number of specialty courts.
Right.
So in the district court in Detroit, you created a domestic violence docket.
Correct.
In the Wayne County Circuit Court, a PPO docket, a
Yes.
personal protection order docket.
Yeah.
And then you were instrumental in bringing the solutions-oriented domestic violence prevention court to Wayne County.
Correct.
Can you talk about why it's so important to have specific dockets or courts that are designed to address domestic abuse?
Domestic abuse is something most people, especially judges, because we're generally not abusive. We may have a lot of power, but we don't generally abuse it. But to understand the dynamics of abuse, you need to be trained in that. And by creating the dockets, we've focused on that. In Wayne County now, all of our judges have been trained in the Enhanced Judicial Skills, which is a national course, which is wonderful. Every judge should do that. Every judge should understand the dynamics of abuse. So creating the specific docket focuses all the staff into being aware of what's going on with the person. Is there violence or is there abusive behavior going on? And that's the biggest problem that you need to deal with, is abusive behavior. And those specialized dockets help the courts to focus on that.
Judge, I know you've been working for years on this issue, and so have I. We've worked together a number of times. What can we do in society? What can we do to stop having to address this issue?
I think what we need to do is recognize that this issue starts in childhood. This is a learned behavior, and we need to do things to help train boys and girls to stop doing this. We need to get to the root causes of what causes abusive behavior and work on that. We also need more men involved. Years ago, some attorneys and I started an organization, which I may come back with, called MARK. Men Acting Responsibly is the key to ending domestic abuse. It can't just be women speaking about abusive behavior. Men have to step forward and help support that, recognize that we do things like mansplaining and all these other things that we've been trained to do. But that's the key. We've all been trained in these roles. My wife's an anthropologist, and we talk about this all the time, that we train people to be abusive. We train people to be submissive. We don't allow people to actually be who they are in our society. And so therefore, we have to go back and start doing that. We have to hold people accountable for their behaviors as adults, but we need to do a lot more in order to recognizing how abusive behavior is part of our culture.
Judge, as I mentioned, you recently retired from the Wayne County Family Court bench. What's next on the horizon for you?
6 months of doing absolutely nothing, and then seeing where my passions take me, whether it's speaking like this or doing other things, writing. I've got a couple books, one of them that I'm working on called The Abuse Virus, how abusive behavior is prevalent in just about everything we do, and we tolerate it. Bullying, it's abusive, shouldn't be allowed. Other things like that. And if we can get rid of the abuse, we can get rid of a lot of this problem. You won't have people in power who run industries who think that they can control the women who work for them. That's what this is all about. It's how we raise people. So 6 months of doing nothing and just enjoying the freedom of responsibility from responsibility, and then get back to doing what I love, which is trying to change things.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Judge, so much for being here
My
today.
pleasure.
And for all your work in this area.
Thank you so much.
We've been talking to Judge Richard Halloran, who recently retired from the Wayne County Family Court bench. He spent a career fighting against domestic abuse, and I expect that we'll still be hearing from him on this topic. After a short break, we'll continue our conversation about domestic abuse with the Executive Director of the Michigan Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence.
I've known Mikhail and Giroux about 6 months.
She's spunky, she's always cracking jokes, she's lighthearted about things.
There was an immediate connection.
And really young at heart also.
I try to keep up with what these young people is doing and knowing.
It's nice that Meals on Wheels created an opportunity for both of us to connect with each other.
We laugh and talk about so many things. They both came and told me she was pregnant.
We were just excited to tell somebody the news we just found out ourselves.
They hadn't even told their family. Oh my gosh, you guys did it! I felt good that I was the first person to know.
We both want our kid to have some of her personality and her characteristics.
I said, you guys have no idea how I really, truly feel about you.
Oh, it's just making me cry.
Drop off a warm meal and get more than you expect. Volunteer at americaletsdolunch.org.
America, let's do lunch.
Welcome back to Legally Speaking. We're talking today about domestic abuse, and we're joined today by Sarah Prout Rennie, the director of the Michigan Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you for having me.
It's such a pleasure to have you here today to talk about this issue. I know you've been an advocate for survivors of domestic abuse and sexual assault for almost 20 years. You started your career as a legal aid attorney and spent a little bit of time as the litigation director at Lakeshore Legal Aid before I joined there, and really made a mark on the work that we do. Then you left and went outside the courtroom to be an advocate at Blue Water Safe Horizons in Port Huron, and now you're the director at the Michigan Coalition. So I'd like to start by talking about where you are today. What does the coalition do? What's its mission and its work?
So the coalition, every county has a domestic violence and sexual assault program. They pay dues to us, and we provide legislative support, training, technical assistance. We are basically their voice at the state and federal level.
So Sarah, you started off your career as a legal aid lawyer, where we work with people who are living in poverty,
right?
And then have continued work in domestic abuse. How do those two things fit together? How does poverty impact domestic abuse?
So domestic violence and sexual assault occur across socioeconomic levels, but the poorer you are, the harder it is to get the assistance that you need. It's hard to access court systems. It's hard to get into safety. Shelters are almost universally full. If you or I were abused, we could take ourselves to a hotel or stay with family and friends, but the isolation and exhaustion of poverty leaves people vulnerable to having to stay in difficult situations.
Sarah, is there ways that we should be working to end that cycle of poverty and abuse?
Absolutely. We are, first, I have to do my shout out to legal services, which is, continues to be a passion of mine. Legal services is one of the key ways in which survivors obtain economic justice, because attorneys can work with the marital estate, get divorces, sue on their behalf. But also, we have some innovative projects at the coalition. We are working with various banks and credit unions to give short-term loans to rehabilitate credit. Maybe somebody is in shelter, has a legal services attorney, but needs just a little bit of money for a uniform or to fix their car. Those barriers when you're in poverty can be insurmountable. However, if we can just give them a little boost, they can often succeed and become stable and safe. Similarly, a lot of times abusers will make sure survivors don't have credit or have poor credit. We have a project to help folks rehabilitate their credit. All of those things are really important, but as always, both legal services and our programs need additional donations and funding to support that.
So Sarah, we've talked a lot about how we advocate on behalf of survivors, but what can we do to help prevent domestic abuse in our communities?
Well, there's multiple layers. One, believe the survivor. Absolutely. We've had a culture for a very long time. If you look at, for example, at the Bill Cosby case, it took 30 to 50 women before we actually believed there was a case against him. So first step is always to believe survivors. And the other thing is to change our social norms to what is acceptable behavior, understanding that domestic violence is not just a family issue. Teach our girls that they don't have to be in a relationship at any cost, and our boys what consent and appropriate masculinity is. And we have a project at the coalition that deals with social norming, particularly on college campuses, because suddenly these kids are in a new sort of co-ed environment, and many of them don't know how to act on their own, and so we're teaching them what appropriate boundaries are, how to engage. But really that needs to start sooner. We need to talk to our kids about sex. We need to talk to our kids about relationships. And I think too often as parents and as communities, we're uncomfortable with those conversations.
Absolutely. On the college campuses, are you talking to both men and women who are there?
Absolutely. So we always want to blame it on the perpetrator, and in domestic violence and sexual assault cases, I use he, she language because percentage-wise, while men can be victims, it's the vast high percentages, according to the Department of Justice, are male perpetrators and female victims. And even in same-sex relationships, it's normally male perpetrators. But we talk to both men and women around healthy masculinity for the men and what consent is. And we also talk about women around what their expectations should be, what their boundaries are, but with not in any way that's putting the pressure or burden on young women, but more about what resources are available.
That's great. So I know that the coalition started a sexual assault hotline last
Yes.
summer. Can you talk about how that got started and what you're doing and why it's so important?
So I have to give enormous credit to Sue Snyder, who was the former governor's wife, and Debbie Kane at the treatment board. When the Larry Nassar scandal broke, we had people calling from all over to our programs, and most of our programs are working on a shoestring budget. They're already overwhelmed, and suddenly there was an enormous influx of need. And the governor's wife and Debbie had a vision that we needed a place for people to call and talk for as long as they needed to talk and be connected to services. So we were asked as the coalition, as the statewide leader, to take on that project. Now they gave us 4 months to build it, which was its own challenge, but we were very proud of the staff to do it, and we continue to get a lot of calls. For example, the documentary series Mute R. Kelly, every time there's something in the news, some people give us a call, but we want everyone to call anytime they feel triggered. We get a lot of folks who were sexually molested as children, and who are seeing these things in our public messaging and feel the need to talk about what happened to them. And you can call 24/7 and speak for as long as you want. You can call back as many times as you need. And then we assess them. We may send them to legal services. We may send them to our member programs, if that's what they want. But it's completely confidential, and it's completely up to the survivor.
And Sarah, what's the number that they should call?
They should call 855-VOICES-4. And I'm going to say that again, 855-VOICES-4. We can't stress enough the importance of the hotline and the importance of reaching out. So much of sexual assault is done in secret, and perpetrators count on the secrecy, and victims need supports to be able to speak up. So you can call until you're ready. If you want to come forward to law enforcement, that's great. If you just need someone to talk to, that's also okay.
For several years, you were the litigation director at Lakeshore Legal Aid and really had an impact on the work that we do in the terms of holistic representation. We still talk about one of the cases that you handled at the appellate court. Can you talk a little bit about that case and what it means for survivors?
That particular case was really important because the survivor it was Muldown versus the city of Warren, and the survivor had been beaten, raped, multiple rapists, and had physical injuries, and then she was eventually sued by her attackers for coming forward. We were fortunate enough to be able to take that case under legal services and take it all the way up to the Sixth Circuit, where we were able to get a decision, a published decision that said that survivors cannot be sued just for coming forward to law enforcement. And it was a pivotal case for me because it really showed some of the failures of our criminal justice system, because certainly victims should never be sued by just coming forward to law enforcement. And it was been often shocking, I tell my husband about it, and my husband's friends, that wasn't already established law. So it also shows how far we have to go and the importance of the work we have to do, both in legal services and as advocates.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for all the work that you've been doing in domestic violence and sexual assault. It really makes a difference for the people who are out there who are experiencing that and the people that are in their lives that are supporting them. So thank you so much for that work.
Well, we appreciate legal services more than you know.
So thank you for joining us on this part of Legally Speaking. We'll be continuing our discussion about domestic abuse after a short break with Macomb County Friend of the Court referee Brian Nicholas.
The right to play on any playing field, you have earned it. The right to hold a job, you have earned it. The right to study in any school, you have earned it. The days of separation and segregation are over.
Welcome back to Legally Speaking. Today we're talking about domestic violence, and we're continuing that conversation with referee Brian Nicholas, who's the chief referee of the Macomb County Friend of the Court. Referee Nicholas, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks. So I think a lot of people don't really understand what the Friend of the Court is and what referees do. Can you talk a little bit about what the Friend of the Court does?
The family division in Macomb has 4 family court judges, and they each have about 12,000 cases. So obviously those judges, to handle all those, they need assistance. And they receive that from the Friend of the Court and from the juvenile division. The juvenile division handles abuse, neglect cases, truancy, juvenile crimes, things of that nature, you'd be dealing with the juvenile component of the family division, or the front of the court is the division you deal with if you have a divorce, a custody case, a support case. And we assist the judges in managing their docket from that aspect. In the initiation of a case, we do investigations for custody, parenting time, child support, spousal support, and we're also the enforcement division after judgments have been entered. We enforce support, we enforce parenting time orders, and we take over that role as well.
So you're involved in those parts of the case process in a family court case, in a divorce or custody matter. Is the referee's job to hold a hearing and issue a ruling, or does the judge come into? Where does the judge come into that?
So each judge in Macomb County has 2 front of the court referees and 1 juvenile referee. In the context of the family court, divorce, custody, support, referees hear hearings on behalf of the judges. They conduct investigations. And they make recommended decisions. In Macomb County, oftentimes people are going to appear before a referee rather than the judge. So at the beginning of a case, if you have a motion for custody, parenting time, or support, you're going to appear in front of a referee. The referees have hearing rooms that look like mini courtrooms. We wear robes, and you argue your case before the referee just as if you are the judge. The referee makes a decision, sometimes gives it interim effect, and you have 21 days to object to that decision and ask for the judge to decide if they want to uphold it. It's your right under the law to have the judge make the final determination. So you have a 21-day period to object. If you don't object within the 21-day period, that stays the order of the court and of the judge.
Okay, so if folks are involved in a divorce or a custody case, their interaction is probably mostly with the friend of the court, and that's kind of the face that they're seeing of the court. But ultimately, they have the right to go in front of a judge and have a hearing there as well.
Correct. More times than not, a lot of their interaction is going to be with the front of the court, rather than whether it be either with a referee, with an investigator, with an enforcement officer for parenting time or support. More times than not, you will be dealing with the front of the court rather than in the courtroom itself with the judge.
Okay. Referee Nicholas, can you talk a little bit about your career before joining the friend of the court? What led you to that position?
My career path was I went to undergrad. I got a finance and banking degree with all intent to become a corporate attorney, rule the corporate world, have a big house, a big car. And when I was at Wayne State University, I started working at the clinical program called the Free Legal Aid Clinic, which provided representation for abuse victims, low-income abuse victims in Wayne County. I found out that I had a passion for it. It's what I really enjoyed doing. Found out that I thought I was good at doing it, and so that changed my whole kind of career path. Thereafter, I was hired by Lakeshore Legal Aid. At the time, it was called the Macomb County Legal Aid Bureau, now called Lakeshore Legal Aid. And there, I was the high conflict divorce or custody attorney, primarily representing abused women in divorce and custody cases.
So you have a lot of experience then with survivors of domestic violence and what that looks like in their lives.
Yeah, it's been primarily my career up until the court, which is an aspect of that. But yeah, it's been a passion of mine and something that I've been involved with my entire life.
And so, can you talk about what is going on in the Macomb County Friend of the Court relating to domestic violence?
So, in the context of domestic violence, more times than not, you're going to appear first in front of a referee and have a hearing where you're going to have to be presenting arguments, probably at that time about custody or parenting time. And that referee is going to be making a decision probably as to temporary custody at the beginning of a case, what parenting time is going to be, and deciding what that schedule is going to be, if there should be some restrictions to parenting time, how often that parenting time should happen. And that's more likely the first time you're going to have contact, and domestic violence is going to be presented in the family court. It's a very intimidating experience. It may be the first time you've been face-to-face with your abuser. And so it's important to educate yourself to that forum. Many people never step foot in a courthouse. It's this big, intimidating building where criminals go, where people sue each other, but most people never step foot in a courthouse.
So if someone who wants to explain to the friend of the court or the court that they are a survivor of domestic violence and they might need special protections in terms of their parenting time arrangement, what's the best way for them to present that information, and how should they go about being prepared for court?
So I often tell people, knowledge is power. You hear that saying all the time. So if you have a case, I would do everything I could to educate myself to the court. There's friend of the court handbooks online. There is a website called MichiganLegalHelp.org, which can provide information in legal forms that's provided through the State Bar of Michigan at no cost. Or you can call Legal Aid, Lakeshore Legal Aid's hotline, which is available to low-income people. So that's one of the first steps I do.
So to get some help outside of, so you're not walking in there blind without a bunch of information.
Right. And you have to be prepared too that the process is a very intimidating process. There's going to be a lot of cases pending, and the court's going to expect you to present your information evidence in a very quick form and a very concise form. And that can be really difficult when it's your first time in a court, it's your first time confronting, perhaps you're being present with an abuser you haven't seen in a long time. So that can be a very daunting and intimidating process. I often tell people you can write down things on a notepad and say to the referee or judge, you know, I'm really nervous, can I read off of this notepad? That helps. But you have to be prepared to have the information in a concise manner. When did it happen? How did it happen? What happened? Because that's the information the court is going to need to make a determination as to visitation and custody, those issues.
So the court and the friend of the court really need that specific information to move forward.
Right. If you have information that supports what you're saying, so one of the questions people say all the time is, I don't have a police report, so you're not going to listen to me. That is absolutely not the case. Those things help support what you're saying.
But they're not required for the court to move forward.
They just help because those are independent sources that help support what you're saying. So if you have a police report, if you've seen a doctor, if you've talked to a therapist, if you've talked to a clergy member, anybody who's an unbiased person, that helps. It is not necessary, however. But you do have to be precise and direct with what you're alleging.
Right. Well, Referee Nicholas, thank you so much for coming today and helping to explain to folks what they should expect when they're coming into the court and they're dealing with domestic violence. We've been talking today with Chief Referee Brian Nicholas from the Macomb County Friend of the Court and concluding a really interesting and important discussion about domestic violence. Thanks for joining us on Legally Speaking.